All right, guys, today we're going to cover chapter 18, which is the urinary system. So there's going to be lots of things to talk about here, as the job of the urinary system really is to cleanse the blood of toxic substances that are developed because of cellular processes throughout the entire body. So the kidney's job is to get rid of it. That's the main job. Also, the kidneys play a role in fluid and electrolyte balance. They have a job in pH control. They have a role in red blood cell production, and they also help to regulate blood pressure. So lots of different things that the kidneys do, and most of which we're going to talk about are going to be cleansing the blood. So let's talk about the anatomy of the urinary system first. So we have two kidneys here and here, two ureters that come off of those kidneys, one bladder, one urethra. So those are the main pieces. So not too many pieces. When we start talking about the kidneys, you'll see that it gets kind of involved. So the kidneys lie against the posterior abdominal wall. We call that retroperitoneal because they sit behind the peritoneum. They're just at kind of start at the 11th rib and are slightly protected by the 11th and 12th rib. They're also protected by some adipose tissue or some fatty tissue. They're about 4 inches long, 2 inches wide, an inch thick, about the size of a computer mouse. They extend from the level of the T12 vertebrae to the L3 vertebrae, so they are farther. Lie also lateral to the spinal cord, so they sit very rear in our body. The right kidney sits a little lower than the left because of the liver, which occupies the space above it. And then we have structures entering and leaving the kidney here in this concave area called the hilum. We'll see that better on this picture here. So let's talk about the different layers. There's 3 different layers to the kidneys. The outermost layer is the renal cortex. The inner layer is the renal medulla. Within the renal medulla, we have these renal columns and these renal pyramids. They actually is where urine formation occurs. Urine then drains into the calyx. We have a minor calyx, which drains, a couple of those drain into a major calyx, and then into the innermost layer or cavity of the kidney called the renal pelvis. And that's really just an open cavity that gets the urine from the kidney and takes it to the ureter. So here's the hilum, and that's where everything kind of enters and exits the kidney. Renal circulation. So we have the renal artery, which branches directly off of the abdominal aorta. About 20% of blood flow goes right into the kidneys. So it gets quite a bit of cardiac output. It brings blood into the kidneys. As it enters, it continues to divide into smaller arteries, just like if it was going into a capillary bed, which is basically what it looks like down inside the kidney. Eventually, it turns into the venous system, and the blood returns to the inferior vena cava by the renal vein. And in here, you can see that it's kind of showing you a nephron. So a nephron, most of the nephron sits up here in the renal cortex, but some of it does dip down into the renal medulla. And the nephron really is the functioning unit of the kidney. So we have about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So there's lots of them. And it's really important that the nephrons get a constant flow of blood because of the job that they're doing. So you can see here, this is 1 of 1 million. So you can imagine how small these really are inside each kidney. And this is one nephron structure. So again, if we want to talk about blood flow, you can see here how the artery comes in and it branches off. Okay, here it's called the afferent arteriole. It goes into what we call the glomerulus. This is like I think it kind of reminds me of a ball of yarn all wrapped up, but it is one continuous vessel there. It leaves the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole, and then it comes out here and becomes the peritubular capillaries. As it wraps around, these are called the renal tubules, and then it eventually becomes the venous system, goes back to the inferior vena cava. It's important to note that the efferent arteriole is smaller in diameter than the afferent arteriole, and that's for good reason. that actually increases the blood pressure inside the glomerulus. And we want that blood pressure to be high because it's going to force particles outside of that capillary bed. And we'll talk more about that. Here's the renal corpuscle, okay? It's this part here. We were just kind of briefly talking about it. Really, the nephron is divided into two sections. One's the renal corpuscle, which contains the glomerulus, this yarn ball-like structure of capillaries, and Bowman's capsule. And then the renal tubules are the other part, and we'll talk about those next. Bowman's capsule consists of 2 layers of epithelial cells surrounding the glomerulus and an open-ended covering. If you think about if you were to push your fist into an inflated balloon, your fist kind of represents the glomerulus, and the balloon, which will fold around your fist in 2 layers, represents Bowman's capsule. And what happens is fluid filters out of the glomerulus and collects in this space between the 2 layers. That's the very first part of urine formation called glomerular filtration. This picture is going to show us the rest of the nephron, which is consisting of the renal tubules. So we have the proximal tubules, we have the loop of Henle, the distal tubules, and the collecting duct. So once blood enters the glomerulus and starts to become filtered, we get what we call renal filtrate that forms and goes into these tubules. Okay, so the first place it's going to end up is the distal convoluted, the proximal convoluted tubule. It's closest to or most proximal to Bowman's capsule. There's thousands of microvilli that allow absorption inside the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's a distinguishing factor. Here, you can see that it's kind of spread out. This diagram is kind of spread out. It's not normally like this. This is all very close together. But after the proximal tubule, it dips down into the loop of Henle. That's where a lot of water reabsorption occurs. Then it becomes the distal convoluted tubules, or just distal tubules. And then a whole bunch of nephrons empty into one collecting duct. So these little branches here would be where you'd find more and more nephrons branching into one collecting duct. These collecting ducts then kind of form those renal pyramids that we saw inside the renal medulla, and then they're actually going to bring urine down into the renal pelvis. So that kind of wraps up the anatomy piece of it. The more complex piece of the renal system or the urinary system is urine formation. And urine formation really happens in 3 different processes. So you need to know all of these different processes and what occurs in each one. Glomerular filtration is the very first step in urine formation. What happens is the blood flows into the glomerulus, which we were just talking about, via that afferent arteriole, which is kind of large. And it travels through all these little areas here, and it comes out the efferent arteriole, which is smaller, so it creates a high amount of pressure in here. The membranes on these arterioles are semi-permeable, so that high pressure forces particles out of that capillary or out of that arteriole, okay, into Bowman's capsule. Almost everything is filtered out of the blood here except for large particles like blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and also large proteins. Everything else kind of gets dumped into Bowman's capsule and becomes what we call urine filtrate. Some of the things that you will see being filtered here and ending up in Bowman's capsule are electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, vitamins, waste products, okay? Some of those things which we need, so we're going to figure out how do we get some of those things back. The amount of blood or fluid filtered by both kidneys is called the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. Okay, it equals about 180 liters each day, or 60 times the body's total blood volume. The body reabsorbs about 99% of this filtrate, leaving 1 to 2 liters to be excreted as urine. So you can see how much actually is filtered out here. And in these next 2 processes, we'll see how we get some of that back. Okay. But it's important that in the glomerulus, we regulate how fast blood is going through there, or we regulate this glomerular filtration rate. We don't want the flow to be too high or too low. If the flow is too high, the body will lose excessive water and nutrients. And if it's too low, the tubules may reabsorb toxins. So our body has a system in place to control that. And that's the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We've talked a little bit about some of this along the way, but let's talk a little bit more about this. How it starts is a decline in blood pressure leads to decreased blood flow to the kidneys. We have these juxtalar glomerular cells in the afferent arterioles that recognize that the blood pressure is low, and they respond by releasing the enzyme renin. Renin converts to angiotensin, which is made in the liver, and then it converts to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 goes to the lungs, where it converts to angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone. Hopefully we remember what aldosterone does. Causes the distal tubules to retain sodium, which leads to an increased retention of water. Remember, it directly affects sodium, but water follows sodium. So therefore, we retain water and our blood volume increases, which causes our blood pressure to increase. So let's watch.
For the body to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance, glomerular filtration should continue at a fairly constant rate, despite periodic changes in blood pressure. A key mechanism for maintaining blood pressure and, therefore, a steady glomerular filtration rate is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. A decline in blood pressure results in decreased blood flow to the kidneys. Specialized cells in the afferent arterioles, called juxtaglomerular cells, respond by releasing the enzyme renin. Renin converts the inactive plasma protein angiotensinogen, which is made in the liver, into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 circulates to the lungs. There, angiotensin-converting enzyme, also called ACE, converts it into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone causes the distal convoluted tubule to retain sodium, which leads to increased retention of water. Blood volume increases and blood pressure rises.
Right, so really this is a job of multiple systems, but we're going to talk about it here a little bit because ultimately the kidneys are the ones that are retaining that sodium, thereby causing the retention of water. So let's finish talking about how urine formation occurs. So the other two processes besides glomerular filtration is tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. So these are kind of opposite or opposing processes that happen. So after the filtrate leaves the glomerulus here, right, and remember everything is kind of filtered out except for those large particles, those large blood cells, and those large proteins. So everything else enters here into the tubules, we ultimately have things in there that we want to get back into the bloodstream, and there's still some things left in the bloodstream that we want to get into the urine to be excreted. So these two processes are going to really help with that. So some of the things that happens is sodium moves by active transport out of the proximal tubules and into the paratubule capillaries. So you can see that here. Active transport means that it requires energy to do that. Sodium, because sodium moves out, water follows sodium, and that's a passive process. So passive transport does not require energy. Then we have things like glucose, amino acids, other electrolytes, chloride, potassium, bicarbonate. They all pass out of the tubules and into the blood. Okay, so most of those are going to occur. All of those electrolytes are going to move via active transport. Water is going to move but via passive transport or via osmosis. Okay, does not require energy. Simultaneously, that's called tubular reabsorption. We're reabsorbing these things back into the bloodstream. Tubular secretion, on the other hand, occurs when we still have waste products ammonia, uric acid, certain drugs, or the breakdown of certain medications, they still stayed in the bloodstream because they were maybe attached to large proteins, but our body needs to get rid of them. So tubular secretion means that here, the capillaries that are kind of wrapped around the tubules actually force those products out of the capillaries into the renal tubules. Okay. Water and sodium are regulated a lot here in the loop of Henle, as well as in the collecting ducts here. So our body has great control over these. If we have too much water, too little water, our body usually knows that via blood pressure. So it can really cause a swing of water there. Let's watch an animation on this.
The creation of urine by the nephrons involves three processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. The first step in the creation of urine from blood plasma occurs in the glomerulus. Blood flows into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole. Because the afferent arteriole is larger than the efferent arteriole, blood flows in faster than it can leave. This contributes to higher pressure within the glomerular capillaries. The pressure causes water and small solutes, such as electrolytes, glucose, amino acids, and nitrogenous wastes, to filter through small pores in the walls of the glomerular capillaries into Bowman's capsule. Blood cells and most plasma proteins are too large to pass through the pores. The fluid that filters into Bowman's capsule then flows into the renal tubules. There, sodium moves by active transport out of the proximal convoluted tubule and into the bloodstream of the peritubular capillaries. Water follows sodium, diffusing rapidly from the tubular fluid into the blood. Glucose, amino acids, chloride, potassium, and bicarbonate also pass out of the tubules and into the blood. About half of the nitrogenous waste, urea, is also reabsorbed. Simultaneously, wastes such as ammonia and uric acid, as well as drugs such as aspirin and penicillin, are secreted out of the blood and into the tubules. Tubular secretion of hydrogen ions also occurs, helping to regulate the body's pH. Next, water diffuses out of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, further concentrating the filtrate. In the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, sodium and chloride are actively pumped into interstitial fluid. The thicker wall of the ascending limb prevents water from following sodium out of the tubule. The distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts reabsorb variable amounts of water and salts. Specialized cells within this part of the nephron play a role in acid-base balance, reabsorbing potassium and secreting hydrogen into the tubule. Finally, the collecting duct reabsorbs water and concentrates the urine.
So once it really hits the collecting duct, it's what we call urine. The rest of when it's all in here is considered filtrate. So tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion are really happening simultaneously. So here's the main hormones that affect the urinary system. The first three are the ones that I want you to know and that we've already talked about on multiple occasions. So you need to know exactly what they do and how they affect the renal tubule and the amount of urine formation. So aldosterone is going to stimulate sodium reabsorption back into the bloodstream. So water is going to follow that. So we're going to have decreased urinary output. ANP is going to do the opposite. It's going to be stimulated when blood pressure is high. It's going to cause the excretion of sodium. Water is going to follow that. We're going to have greater amounts of urinary output. Blood pressure is going to decrease. Antidiuretic hormone is going to reabsorb water, directly reabsorb water, therefore increasing our blood volume, increasing our blood pressure, less urine output. So the composition of urine, page 355, you'll want to certainly take a peek at here and know the differences. So urine is about 95% water, 5% dissolved substances. If you're looking on page 355, the color should be a pale yellow to an amber. Darker urine usually results from poor hydration or dehydration. Should not be cloudy. It should be nice and clear. should have a mild odor. The specific gravity should be 1.001 to 1.035. The specific gravity of water is 1, which talks, the specific gravity in general is the amount of dissolved solutes. So, of course, urine is going to have more dissolved solutes than water, which is why that ranges above the specific gravity of water. And the pH averages from 4 to 8, or ranges from 4 to 8 with an average of 6. So urine is a little bit acidic, and most healthy adults produce 1 to 2 liters of urine per day. Okay, so the kidneys are where the urine is formed. So what are we going to do with it, and how are we going to get rid of that from there is the rest of the functions of the urinary system. So the ureters are going to transport that urine to the bladder. The bladder is going to store it, and then the urethra is going to connect the bladder to the exterior, and that's how we're actually going to void it or get rid of it. So the wall of the bladder is made of the detrusor muscle, okay? Consists of 3 layers of smooth muscle. Inside the bladder, we have these layers or folds called rugae. It allows the bladder basically to expand and contract. The floor of the bladder has 3 openings, 2 for the ureters, which are coming from each kidney, and 1 from the urethra. They form this triangular shaped smooth area called the trigon. Infections commonly occur there. At the point where the urethra leaves the bladder is a ring of smooth muscle that forms the internal urethral sphincter. And below that, we have a second sphincter, the external urinary sphincter. In the urethra in females is much, much shorter than the urethra in males. It's also why females are much more common or prone to getting urinary tract infections. The urethra in men also is part of the reproductive system because sperm also travels along that same path. Unlike in females, the urinary system and the reproductive tract are 2 totally separate things. So how does urination actually occur? We get when the bladder starts to get full, it sends impulses to the spinal cord. Usually about 200 to 400 milliliters of urine sends this impulse. The spinal cord sends a signal back that allows the internal sphincter to relax. And voiding will occur involuntary unless the brain overrides the impulse. So the brain we have voluntary control over the external sphincter. So the internal sphincter is controlled by the spinal cord. That's going to relax. You're going to feel that initial urge to void, but we can hold it, right? So we can still continue to contract our external sphincter, and we have control over that. So you think about people who have spinal cord injuries, and often that's why they have urinary incontinence, or why they're incontinent of urine. Let's watch this last animation here.
Urination, which is also called micturition, begins when the external sphincter muscle of the bladder voluntarily relaxes and the detrusor muscle of the bladder contracts. The entire process involves several steps requiring input from the central nervous system. Specifically, when the bladder contains 200 milliliters or more of urine, stretch receptors in the bladder wall send impulses to the sacral region of the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends motor impulses to the bladder wall to contract and to the internal sphincter to relax. When this happens, voiding will occur involuntarily unless the brain overrides the impulse. The brain can override the impulse to void because stretch receptors in the bladder also send impulses to the micturition center in the pons. The pons integrates information from the stretch receptors with information from other parts of the brain, such as the cerebrum, and evaluates whether the time is appropriate to urinate. If the time to urinate is not appropriate, the brain sends impulses to keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which inhibits urination. If the time to urinate is appropriate, the brain sends signals to the bladder wall to contract and to the external urethral sphincter to relax. At that point, voluntary urination will occur.
So you need to know which one's voluntary and which one's involuntary for sure. So you can definitely know that the internal sphincter is involuntary, external sphincter voluntary. Okay, that finishes this up.